But we're sort of, it's not unlike a tent, this place that we live in here on federal land as a result of the kindness of the Sydney Harbour Federation Trust, which controls all of this land here. It's a bit like being in a camp. So the spirit is with us. And when I was asked by our lovely hostess if I could talk about the artist camp, can you hear that?
Yeah.
I thought, gee, I'll be able to lie and make things up. And then I made the mistake of mentioning the name of Albie Thoms, who wrote a book about the artists' camp. So I thought, oh, my capacity to fabricate is severely limited. However, we'll see if he detects us. If he puts his hand up and says, no, Paul, you've got it wrong. Well, the artist camp that my great-grandfather, Julian Ashton, was involved in was on Edwards Beach, the north end of Edwards Beach. Now, you all know, possibly most of you are members of the very salubrious Balmoral Beach Club, but that was the site of that camp, and so they took away those glorious artefacts to put up that building, and I think that mirrors in a way, if you can see behind Albie, there's a painting of the harbour that we've done. There's the amphitheatre, which of course was also pulled down to make way for the flats, the block of flats, which Clive Lucas has been arranged to have a heritage order put on. What a pity he was there a bit earlier. You'll find that my talk has many digressions because I can go down little creeks that Albie hasn't been down, you see, and whereas the big issues, of course, Albie understands. Now, I was on a walk with my grandfather, Howard Ashton, down those steps at the north end. Remember the step? You know the steps there at the north end of the beach? Going down those steps, he said, of course, Paul, this was all a rock face here, and we used to have to go around by the beach. And there was a creek that came down alongside that road, the grove, that area there, and that fed the camp. Actually, the camp was just alongside, it just drifted into the sand. And in the 1880s, Livingston Hopkins. Now, Livingston Hopkins, this is Livingston Hopkins here. That's the original of a drawing by Phil May. It's a wonderful drawing. I'm going to have it restored because it's obviously getting a bit of foxy. But that's Livingston Hopkins. That's Maximilian Schell, who was an American artist, and this is Julian Ashton in profile here. And that would have been done about the time of the artist camp at Edwards Beach. Now, that's part of our collection. Livingston Hopkins in the 1880s leased 50 acres at the north end of the beach, of Edwards Beach. And he built a camp, and there were a number of tents, probably about 4 or 5 tents, and Julian joined him soon afterwards. Now, Julian had previously had a camp on the Hawkesbury at Dora Creek. J.J. Hilda's mother had a house at Dora Creek, and quite a lot of her friend, well actually his camp, the original camp was with A.J. Daplin, who I think you're going to talk about, aren't you? Who was a wonderful artist, but he was also involved with the camp. Now, but Julian had a camp before that at Dora Creek, and a lot of his students used to come with him to that. The camp at Balmoral was mostly involved artists from the picturesque atlas of Australia. Julian was brought out from England as he was known as an illustrator in England. He was brought out to work on the illustrated atlas, and they used to go around Australia, these artists, painting scenes, and they'd be sent back to Sydney or to Melbourne, where the work was done, to sign to the publishers, and then they would be turned into engravings, and that's another art, of course, which has been lost. It was a haven for unconventional spirits who wished to break with the academy of dogs with wet noses and stags at bay. It's hard for us to imagine now that art was so restricted. And of course, Julian had studied in Paris at the Académie Julian at the same time as quite a number of the Impressionist painters who were to become famous in Europe. And this painting, I'm just mentioning that one there, sorry. Now, if I would say, take my little file here, where are we? I'm just... yes, here it is. This is quoting from Julian's book. And to give you a bit of background, shortly after my arrival in Australia, I made the acquaintance of Louis Bouvelot. He was a Swiss, a dear old chap, simple, somewhat silent, and of a serious turn of mind. He had not much English, and my knowledge of French made me a welcome guest at his little cottage in East Melbourne. Often I sat with him under the shade of a vine-covered trellis at his home and discussed over a bottle of red wine and talked of the old days and the old lands. In figure he was just over average height and a little stooped. He reminded me very much of Jean-Francois Millet as I saw him walking along with a large sketchbook under his arm. He would stop before some tumble-down old humpy with a big tree growing over it and perhaps a distant hill in the background and make a very careful and beautiful pencil drawing. He would take this home and redraw it on a larger scale. And though the colour of his work was not at all Australian, it was produced with a knowledge and facility of execution which gave everything he touched artistic value. One painting of his, The Waterpool at Coleraine, painted in 1860, which is in the National Gallery of Melbourne. That's the background. People used to actually draw outside and then go into their studios to paint. And he goes on, during the weekends I went out sketching, because Julian loved painting out of doors, and sketching of course, and in this way came across a young lad of about 14 or 15 years of age whose drawings interested me. On weekdays he drove a baker's cart for his mother, and on Saturdays and Sundays he laid the foundation of his knowledge of art in the open air. The young man was Fred McCubbin. So Julian goes back a hell of a long way, and this is his introduction, I suppose the introduction he gives to Livingston Hopkins and Phil May. During my time with the Picturesque Atlas of Australia in Sydney, I got to know Livingston Hopkins and Phil May of the Bulletin. Hopkins brought Phil May to my studio the day he landed in Sydney, and I saw him frequently from that time until his return to London. In appearance, May was very slight, about 5 foot 7 inches in height. His hair was cut straight across his forehead, and he wore very close-fitting garments, giving him somewhat the appearance of a jockey. He had a very observant eye, slightly hooked nose, sounds like Norman Lindsay, doesn't it? And an expressive and mobile mouth. His manner was courteous and nearly always deferential, and he could suffer fools gladly to a degree that I do not remember to have seen equal. So, now where was it? And then we go on to Livingston Hopkins. Livingston Hopkins, and he was the man that set up the camp, remember? An American, at a very early age displayed a gift for humorous drawing. Though he had no artistic training in the usual sense of that term, he was beginning to take a prominent place in American illustrated journalism when Mr. Trail, who was the editor of the Picturesque Atlas, brought him out here, to the Bulletin. The Bulletin, that's right. He was a tall man with a remarkable face, deep-set dark eyes, strongly marked nose, and a thick dark hair. His habitual expression was somewhat sad, made so I think because his heavy drooping eyelids. Now there is a picture up here of Hop did at the time of the camp, and at the very top, closest to this big mural, you can see he's actually pointing to a picture of himself with his head sticking out of the head. He would brighten up considerably under the influence of a drink or two, and with a solemn face tell humorous stories of his early adventures. He greatly regretted that he had not had a training of drawing. He once said to me, "I am the last artist who will be able to amuse the public, though not a draftsman." In actual fact, how wrong he was. I don't think Patrick Cook, who I love and admire, ever went to art school. Nevertheless, and many other artists, of course, haven't got to. He'd probably say, "I did go to art school, Paul." He was a neighbour of mine. He lived in Byron Avenue when he was growing up. We grew up together. He's doing these great things for the Spectator now. Nevertheless, he succeeded in making Australia laugh once a week for 20 years. So, we had a bicentenary enactment of the camp. The wonderful Mayor of Mosman, I think he's still the longest serving Mayor of Mosman, Barry O'Keefe. I don't know whether anyone has succeeded his incredible contribution to Mosman, but it was during one of his reigns that it was decided to do a reenactment of the artist camp. And here is a painting by my uncle Richard Ashton, who is Julian's grandson, did of the camp. And I did quite a few paintings, but unfortunately I sold them and didn't have the presence of mind to photograph them before they disappeared. But that's very much as it was, and that's exactly where, actually it's not exactly where, because as I said before, the Beach Club is on the exact site, but that painting is really, we had a series of tents. We had speeches, we had talks, we had music, we had a wonderful exhibition that Shelley Rose put on in a big tent I think, do you remember that? Yeah.
It's great.
It was good, wasn't it?
Oh, fantastic.
So could you hold it up? I don't think I can see it.
Do you want me to hold this up and speak at the same time?
Lot number one.
Thank you, Albie.
Richard Ashton in 1988, wasn't it?
1988,
yes.
It was in 88.
It's not one of the originals, but it's recreates it.
That's right, that's not one of the original camp. That is the facsimile camp, the reenactment of the camp. You had a long enough look at that?
Oh, I've got looking. I'm worried about my colleagues.
Of course. This is the sort of thing that happens in the art world in Mosman. People are concerned for each other. You know, it's a wonderful lobby group. That's how we got the art gallery. Did you know that, Mr. Cheeseman? Are you here? Mr. Cheeseman should know. It was the Mosman Art Society and people who felt passionately about art in Mosman who lobbied the council, and eventually the council said, yes, we'll do it. And the wonderful, who's that lady who's just retired, Kay Clark, rang me up and said, we've done it! We've done it! And they got money from the government and so on. And now we have our wonderful gallery. But it was the people of Mosman that fought for that. Fantastic. Old Ben, I thought it was old Ben who was in that picture. Did we put it up? I don't know, but it wasn't. In fact, Albie just said to me, no, Paul, you can't get that one. That one there, it's not Albie. It's not, is it? It's somebody else.
This is actually the Curlew camp. And
that's right.
That's the cook at the Curlew camp.
That's right.
Old Ben was the cook
at Julian's camp. Oh, at the
Hops camp.
Hops camp. Now, there's a wonderful story, quite a few stories about old Ben, and I'm going to tell you things that you haven't heard before, and of course they will be recorded by that instrument of terror at the back of the room for posterity. Old Ben first came to my notice through my grandfather Howard Ashton, because he told me the story of that painting of the Prospector in the Art Gallery of New South Wales. He said it was painted at Tamarama Beach, and my father turned his back on one of the most beautiful views in the world and placed Ben against the cliff face. And that's why the light is so wonderful in it. It's a saturated light. It's full of animation, that light, full of gold. Full of gold. Full of gold, Albie. And it was, the spade is so beautiful. It's a wonderful piece of painting, really. And he said, I used to go down after school and help bring things up to the house, because Julian just lived up in Fletcher's Glen, which was just up behind there. I know this is not directly concerned with the camp, but I think Ben is an important figure. And he said, Ben was quite simple, Paul, because I said to him on one occasion, what are you doing, Ben? He said, well, Master Howard, I am posing for your father. I am fossicking for gold, and this is the pan that I am fossicking with. And being a boy, and a naughty boy, I said to him, have you got any gold, Ben? And you could see his eyes clouding over, and he was thinking for a long time, and then finally decided, no, come to think of it, young Master Howard, I have not got any gold. Which I think gives a poignancy to that painting, you know, in a sense it was total disaster on the goldfields, and it's all written in his face. But it wasn't the goldfields, it was Tamarama Beach after all. But that painting is one of the great paintings, and it was interesting, I was invited by the curator of drawings, Prince, at the Wallara Waverley Council the other day to identify a work which was by Julian, which had been given to the Fletcher, the daughter of Fletcher, after whose Fletcher's Glen was named. And I was looking at trying to get as much information as I could, and I peeled off a bit of paper that had been stuck on the back, quite recently, and there was this lovely drawing of Old Ben.
Oh, how fantastic.
So in fact the watercolour, which was a good watercolour, but it was not of such importance. And so I contacted Henry Collenberg at the Art Gallery of New South Wales. I said, is there a way of peeling this off? And he said there was. And so hopefully the Art Gallery of New South Wales will get this drawing of Old Ben, and the Waverley Willara Council will get the work on the other side, which of course has great value for them, being a local subject. These things happen all the time. And those of you who collect works, always be careful with them and treat the back with great care, because quite often you might find treasure on the back, or some evidence on the back, which is of great interest to scholars.
Are you going to mention Robert Louis Stevenson?
I will, sir. Are you worried that you're not going to
No, I'm just
How's the time going?
Still standard.
just while you're on Ben though.
What?
About another 10?
Oh, well, I need more than that.
Because Robert Louis Stevenson went to
He's interrupting me.
You got that story in there?
I've got some lovely stories.
About Old Ben being in one of his books. Yeah,
That's right.
yeah.
That's right. There's a painting up there, by the way, of Mosman's Bay by Julian, done at the same time as the camp, which is arguably one of the first, well, certainly the first en plein air painting done in Mosman. Certainly not in Australia, but in Mosman. It's a perfect setting down there. The moon rises out of the sea against a backdrop of the noble prow-shaped North Head. Perfect again, now that the net is gone. Please, ladies, come in. No, I insist, there's lots of chairs. Please. Oh, I see, okay. Now, Julian used to sleep on occasions in an old boat on the beach. He loved the open-air life and was a very early riser. And my mother remembers the smell of freshly brewed coffee at 5 a.m. when she was staying in his house at Bondi. His son, Percy, was a sea captain, sailed around the Horn, and he used to deal in coffee and used to supply coffee. There was a dining tent. Ben, as I say, was the permanent chef cook. The camp oven, with a camp oven, roast meat, salt beef, and all that sort of stuff. And wild spinach they used to eat, which grew on the beach, and still down there, by the way. Jim Jackson's an expert on wild spinach. Now, wives didn't often come. Eliza Ashton, my great-grandmother, was a councillor of the Women's Suffrage League with Rose Scott, and one of Australia's first women journalists. And there's a lovely story that Howard told about his mother being chained to the railings of Government House while his father, Julian, was having dinner with the governor inside. Years later, I found the Julian box Julian's paint box under the house at Balmoral at Tadapa in Barron Avenue. And I thought, what are these silly legs on the bottom of this box? It's a very useful box, this, so I ripped them off. And Howard was absolutely furious. And he was only ever angry with me once, and I felt so chagrined that I had made him angry. Look, I didn't know what the hell it was. I was only about 12. So what I did was, later on, I arranged to have someone to refabricate the legs. I should have it here today. I think we had it in your exhibition from memory.
Yeah, we did. Yeah.
And if you do it again, I offer it to you again, dear Albie. Visitors to the camp, by the way, Charles Condell is one of my most distinguished artist visitors. But visitors who weren't artists included Robert Louis Stephens, who knew A.J. Daplin and Julian, and presented Ben the Cook with a copy of Treasure Island. Julian describes him as a thin, fragile figure, and he said the literary world of Sydney lionised him, which he loved. And in the Union Club, of which I'm a member, there is a cartoon by George Molnar, and Stevenson is up in the cartoon. He used to pace the floor when he was thinking, and of course people came from the far corners of the Union Club to listen to him recite his poetry. And in the club there was a chair, a planter's chair in the library, which if you feel very important you can sit in, and although it's very uncomfortable and people tend to avoid it. Julian visited him on a number of occasions in the club, and in his book, which is here somewhere, and he talks at length about that, but seeing I've only got 10 minutes and I'll have to talk at one.
Paul, do you want to hand around any of the pictures for people to look at?
Oh yes, that's a good idea. There's pictures here. You might like to look at those. They're self-explanatory, I believe. I'll keep going because I better keep going. Ada Cambridge, who was a writer, described the camp as a cluster of little tents a little garden, a woodstock, a water tub, almost hidden in the trees. The camp looked out on the great gateway of the Heads. It had floors of pine boards, all the comforts of home. Other visitors, of course, included Phil May and J.F. Archibald, who was described as playing quoits on the beach. And musicians and thespians visited. Hanson and George Rignold, who lived nearby, bought a house nearby. And Hop later bought a house in Mosman in 1890. And Julian, who lived at Bondi, I think he stopped visiting at that stage. Howard, my grandfather, bought a house as a result of Gruner, Elias Gruner, building a house alongside Howard, alongside Julian in Bondi. And Howard had bought the block of land behind, and he said to Gruner, if you build a house there, Elias, you'll block out my view of the sea. And Gruner said, well, I bought the land now, and I love your father, and I want to live next to him. And he said, well, Howard said, well, bugger that. So he went and bought land in Burren Avenue, which is where I still am. And so we all owe it to Gruner, and who, of course, was a wonderful painter. And there were wonderful stories about Gruner, by the way. He was a very shy, decent man and a wonderful painter. And there are quite a number of paintings by Sid Long from the camp, which you'll see in that little thing that I sent you. And there's one in the back. And also here you'll find there's another Sid Long, if you have a look in there. I think you've all got that. Hop later bought a house in Mosman, and as I say, Julian stayed in Bondi. How Julian's son became a sea captain and sailed on square riggers around the Horn and lived at Chinaman's Beach on the edge of the water. And he once said to me, I once said to my Uncle Percy, why do you come out here in the early morning, Uncle Percy? Because he used to make coffee there. And because he used to come out, his rule was, he'd have this Dutch window opening it very close to where Ken Doan is, and he'd open this top half of it and he'd put his cup on this little Dutch door, the level top of it, and he would look out into the sea, and he'd said, I went on square riggers round the sea, round the Horn, sea dog stuff, you know. And then he said, and you know, young Paul, in the morning I come out here before your Aunt Dora, who was a wonderful, Dora Wager was a wonderful jeweller, by the way, and you probably know her, those people who are familiar with jewellery would know her work. And he said, I put my cup there, and I looked down into the sea, and I spit in it. And of course, Hugh McRae lived in Burren Avenue area around there. There were quite a lot of artists, and it really was an artist's colony. The Bohemianism is only kept alive now by me. I am an artist, and I'm working hard at a single-handed job. If any of you want to join me and cast off your bourgeois trappings, come and eat spinach with me on the beach. Wild spinach. Arthur Streeton. Now he, of course, I will tell a very short story, please, Madam Hostess. 2 or 3 years before the Federation of Australian States, this is from Julian's book, which took place in 1900, a large number of English and foreign paintings were sent to Victoria and housed in the exhibition building. The trustees of the Sydney Gallery thought there might be some pictures worth purchasing for their collection. And Mr. Montefiore, the Secretary of the National Gallery Trust, and I were asked to go down and make such purchases as we considered advisable. That's the way they used to talk in those days. We agreed upon the purchase of Ever Shifting Home by Stanhope Forbes, oh my God, and the Venetian Cafe of Milton Fisher. Mr. Montefiore was very desirous that we should purchase a small painting by Waterloo called The Fisherman's Return. The subject was a woman hurrying along the pier. Her back was to the spectator, and she was holding a baby aloft with its little arms outstretched towards a burly, bearded fisherman in heavy sea boots and conventional sou'wester. The picture was well drawn and painted, but was far too sentimental, I thought. If I remember right, the price was 150 guineas. I could not agree to the purchase, and we parted in the afternoon somewhat frigidly. This is a very important little story. Strolling down Collins Street, I met young McCubbin, who had by that time become a teacher in the National Art School. He asked if I had seen the exhibition of Australian art in the little gallery on Eastern Hill. I had not. We retraced our steps to have a look at it. The majority of the pictures were not interesting. I was brought to a halt by a large canvas called Still Glides the Stream and Shall Forever Glide. I asked McCubbin who painted it. He said it had been painted by a young Australian, Arthur Streeton, who was learning lithography with one of the firms in Melbourne. I inquired the price of the picture, which I learned was $85. Up to this time, no Australian picture, with the exception of one or two in Sydney, the work of Mr. Pigonet, had ever been bought by either the Melbourne or the Sydney galleries. Isn't that shameful? Unbelievable! God, we should all be bohemians. When I met Montefiore at the exhibition the next day, the subject of The Fisherman's Return was brought up again. I mentioned that I had been impressed by the work of a young artist for which only half the amount was asked, and asked if he would come with me to see it, which he did. I told him I would agree to the purchase of Waterloo's picture on condition that Streeton's canvas was also bought. Melbourne rubbed its artistic eyes the next morning when it heard that the Sydney National Gallery had purchased a picture by young Arthur Streeton. It is of interest that a Streeton bought about the same time, in the same place, recently bought 1,000 guineas. This was written in 1942. The president of the trustees of the New South Wales Art Gallery, the Honourable Edward Coombs, had evidently been prejudiced against the purchase of the Victorian picture. Isn't it amazing they have to fight so hard for such obviously beautiful pictures? It still probably applies, yes, you're right. But his first remark when we met was, "I cannot see what made you so keen about that picture of young Streetons." I replied, "Well, this is an Australian art gallery, and that is certainly the best piece of Australian landscape I've ever seen. It has the very spirit of a calm summer evening towards sunset." "What do you make of that bird in the foreground?" asked the Honourable Edward. I said I thought it was all right, probably a magpie. "Well, he has the white on the wing in the wrong place, and that grass in the foreground." "Well, what of it? It looks all right." "But man, it's Parramatta grass. How could you have Parramatta grass in Melbourne?" I told him that Streeton himself would be coming up shortly and that he could put the matter before him. Streeton was a slim, debonair young man of about 24 years of age, with a little golden pointed beard and a fair complexion. When he wasn't painting, he was quoting Keats and Shelley. I went to the gallery with him. His picture was taken down to the basement for him to look at. After considering it for some time, he rubbed a little oil over the Parramatta grass, put another flick of paint somewhere or other on the wing of the bird, and then asked me to bring the president down. When Mr. Coombs saw the picture, he told Streeton he had greatly improved it. Quite satisfied. 2 or 3 years later, Streeton painted his large canvas Fires On. It represented the mouth of a tunnel on a blazing Australian summer's day. The sandstone surface, which had been blasted to pierce a tunnel through the hillside, shows yellow against the dark opening. The steep hill on the left is in shadow. The heavy sandstone boulders are covered with that bluish-grey patina which time gives to sandstone in the open. From the entrance, men are seen running out of the tunnel before the charges explode. The hazy blue of the midsummer looks down upon the whole. I had spoken to several of my brother trustees about this extraordinary painting, the vitality of the work, the accuracy of the observation, and the simplicity of the means used to produce that blaze of light and colour. When I met with the president, Mr. Dufour, at the opening of the exhibition where this picture was shown, he said he believed I was in favour of the purchase of the picture for the gallery and inquired upon what grounds I admired it so much. I said, well, first of all, it does not rely for its success upon any one of the usual sentimental transcripts of nature. The earth has been torn and blasted to carry a train through the hill. The heat of the day is tremendous, and one is struck by the simplicity of the means used. Each brushstroke saying unfalteringly what it has to say with very few colours, telling the story of the everyday life and toil of men in this vast continent. I thought this might soothe him, but it didn't. Well, Mr. Ashton, he said, that picture will never be purchased as long as I am president of this trust. I fear I lost my temper, for I replied, that picture will be bought, whether you like it or not. Now, that's a preamble for the Curlew Camp, which was, and a wonderful book, of course, which was written by Linda Slutskin, who, God, was a most wonderful woman, your late dear wife, and the wonderful Albie Thoms, who I hand over to now.
Thank you. Before we leave that artist camp, it was we to tell a little story that I heard from Richard about Howard, that Howard had told him about going to that camp, because Howard would have been quite young, and he lived with his father over there at Tamarama, and they'd walk to get to the camp, they'd walk into the city to the ferry, get the ferry across to Mosman Bay, walk up Avenue Road. By that time, Howard was very thirsty, so he always insisted when he got to the top of the hill at Avenue Road that his father and he made a cup of tea. So they must have carried a billy with them. Then they'd walk along the military road up to Mandalong, down to Mandalong to the camp. So it was quite an effort for a little kid to be coming all that way. Obviously for Julian, who seemed to be incredibly physically fit, because there's one of the stories in his book about him rowing. That's right. The Malian back, in a skiff. So he must have been physically very strong. So I just remember that this painting reminded me of Richard telling me that.
That's one.
The Curlew camp wasn't an artist camp specifically. It was founded by the Brash brothers, particularly Reuben Brash. I don't know how many of you remember Brash's department store up there in Oxford Street? That was established by Reuben when he moved from Melbourne. His family had come out to Melbourne in the gold rush. They were German Jews. They set up making tents and things for the gold diggers. Became very wealthy. And then Reuben then came to Sydney and established his store. His sister Golda stayed behind in Melbourne, and she married Louis Abrahams, who was a friend of Tom Robertson, one of the painters in the Heidelberg camp in Melbourne. The Abrahams family manufactured cigars, and they were the ones that made the cigar boxes that you see in those 9x5 paintings by the Melbourne artists. Golda and Louis Abrahams got married in Sydney, and Tom Roberts came up for the wedding, and that's when he met Reuben and the rest of the family. So that when he came back to Sydney 5 or so years later, he went over to the camp that they had at Little Sirius Cove. I'm sure you all know where Little Sirius Cove is, between Taronga Park and Mosman Bay. It was a bit of land reserved for the military. Before it became the zoo, it was a military land. And so they, unlike Hop, who rented his property for the camp, they just grabbed it and put up their tents there, and used to row across from Parsley Bay on the weekends to camp there. Not long after they'd established the camp, you can see if you go down there, there's a rock, and it's got 1890 in it, so that's when they established it. Sydney, Australia was hit by a big depression, much bigger than the one we just had, I think, but not as big as the 1930s one. And so a lot of people were out of work and no one did. So that camp down at Curlew became a residence for a number of people. It had its old cook, I can't remember his name, it wasn't Old Ben, but they also had a permanent cook. And when Tom, first of all, Streeton, as Paul said, Streeton came up to Sydney, retouched his painting to please Coombs, went back to Melbourne and suddenly found that the depression had hit, no market, so he decided to come to Sydney with. Obviously there was a market. One thing Paul didn't mention, Julian got elected a trustee of the Art Gallery. One of his first acts as a trustee, he insisted that they reserve £1,000 a year for buying Australian art.
I wasn't given time to...
No, but you've set that up perfectly. So, with the Art Gallery having that money, Sydney was the best market, probably the only market for Australian artists, because no one else was particularly much interested in buying them, as Paul explained. So Streeton came up, and no money, nowhere to stay, so of course he got in touch with Reuben and ended up becoming a permanent resident there for quite a while at that camp. Tom Roberts was still in Melbourne at that time, but he came up a bit later and then he joined him there. And there's wonderful correspondence between them, collected in a book called From Smike to Bulldog, which the letters that Streeton wrote before Roberts came up, explaining what a good time he's having at the camp. So obviously when Tom came back, he went straight there. We've got some pictures. Well, this is the only picture of the Curlew camp, this one here. That was taken by Fred Delmar. He was one of the residents of the camp. He was a a mathematician at Sydney University. I mean, these days mathematicians at the university probably get a pretty good pay, but obviously then in the Depression there wasn't much pay, so he became a resident camp, and he took the only photo we have of that early period. This is another one of Streeton painting on the beach there at Curlew Camp. Probably, that looks like pretty much up just near where the Scout Hall is there in Sirius Cove. And that was taken by Rodney Cherry, who also took this one, which is Tom Roberts sitting in a boat. I'll pass that round, you can pass that one round. I was lucky, we found those photos in the possession of the daughter of Rodney Cherry. They were only little snapshots, little Kodak snapshots. And that one of Streeton painting had been used in a book, but no one had known who'd taken it. But then we found one of the boat, and there's another, a cricket match. There they are playing cricket. Pass it around. That's the beach just between Sirius Cove and Tronga. I've forgotten the name of it. Do you remember
Whiting
that?
Beach.
Yeah, Whiting Beach. So that's on the. You can go and stand on the spot where they played cricket. So Roberts and Streeton were the main artists of the Curlew camp, living there with the Brash brothers. But many visited, and Julian visited in his book. He mentions visiting there, and they'd get the ferry to Mosman, walk over the ridge and down to Sirius Cove. There's some steps there that have recently been restored, and they'd ring a bell or shout out, and someone would row across and pick them up and take them over to the camp. And there's a Daplin painting. I think you passed that one out already.
I think it's been passed out, yes.
Yeah.
Somewhere else.
There's a painting by Alfred Daplin that looks like it was painted. I stood on the spot, and it looks like it was painted there on that landing where they used to go across. That one, yeah. Julie's holding it up there at the back. That looks like the landing where they row across to the Curlew camp. Another of the residents there was Henry Fullwood, who also was one of the people that lived in the Edwards Beach camp. Right. And he was also one of the artists on the picturesque Atlas of Australia. But he, down on his luck, had to go and live in the camp because eventually his fortunes were restored, and he lived in various houses around Mosman and continued to paint it right up till the 1920s. There's quite a number of forward paintings of Mosman scenes done over a period of about 30 or 40 years. Alfred Daplin, who did that painting, as far as I know, didn't ever live in the Curlew camp, but of course he was the only permanent, apart from old Ben, the only permanent resident in Hops camp for a while. He was a teacher for the Society of the Artists, and he lived in that camp there, and he wrote a book which was the standard sort of text on landscape painting, and this copy is I think about 5th edition or something, but it was still selling in the 1920s. They kept on reprinting it, landscape painting from nature in Australia. Daplin had studied in Paris and painted en plein air, in the open air, in the Fontainebleau forest with the Barbizon painters, as had Julian and George Collingridge, also another Sydney painter at the time. They were the first people to actually get out in the open air and do finished paintings. Until then, as Paul said, people went out and sketched, went back to the studio and finished it. But of course, early in the 19th century, someone had invented zinc tubes for oil paint. So you could actually take your paints out and paint on the spot. And it was quite controversial. There was an academy in Paris, same in England, that thought that sort of thing wasn't right. Watercolours that people used for sketching too were considered drawings. They weren't finished works. So Daplin was very important in Australia to promote that idea, as was Julian, and the two of them in fact taught together. Before Julian established his school, he was teaching for the arts. So I'll pass that around if you'd like to have a look. There's that page marked there there's a photo of a painting by William Lister, which was done just on the hill over here, looking up for the head. So we're very close to the site of one of the paintings. There's also recently an auction. There was a Streeton painting done up on that point there. So while they lived in those two camps, they also wandered around all these hills and ridges. Julian was one of the first to paint Mosman Bay, but there's a very famous Tom Roberts painting done at Mosman Bay that's in the New England Art Gallery collection.
It should be in Mosman collection, shouldn't it, Albie?
Yes, I mean it's I think it's one of Mosman Roberts' best paintings. That one.
Wonderful.
This one is in the Art Gallery of New South Wales. It's a painting of the Curlew camp.
Quite tiny.
It's a tiny little one. That's about the size of it. But it's a sort of superb little work and captures just that idyllic setting that they have there. If you'd like to pass that one around. So Roberts and Streeton lived there for a while. Then they'd come and go as they made their trips around Australia doing other paintings and commissions. Roberts in particular was making his living as a portrait painter most of that time. His landscapes weren't selling. In fact, his very famous painting of the Bailed Up, which was done in this period in the 1890s, it wasn't sold to 1927. No one wanted it, which is quite remarkable.
We haven't seen those.
So as well as those extremely famous painters, almost anyone that wanted to paint in Sydney in those days would visit the camps, and there's records of many lesser known painters going there. But it's become known for the work of Streeton and Roberts. Paul mentioned Charles Condra being a student at the camp down here in Edwards Beach. He then from there went down to Melbourne and got associated with the Heidelberg camp, and people tend to think of him then as a Melbourne painter. But I think there's a whole sort of myth being established that Impressionism was invented in Melbourne. I think it was at this camp here, and it was one of the painters that visited often was Girolamo Nerli, the Italian painter who painted wonderfully impressionistic works before Roberts and Streeton. So Melbourne had the first art historians, and they wrote the books about Australian art, and the Heidelberg camp then became the place to be. In fact, I think this camp, Edwards Beach, was really significant. And the other thing is that the paintings that Roberts and Streeton are probably best known for are the ones done while they were living here in Sydney. So it's time, I think, to reverse the false history of all that. After they moved on from the camp, Streeton went on to London, and Tom Roberts went back to Melbourne. The camp was taken over by Freddie Lane. He was a swimmer and Australia's first Olympic gold medalist in swimming. And he left some photos, and I got these from his daughter, Mrs. Rubinson, and they're now in the Mosman Library. But there's a photo of Freddie's tent. You can see it's quite elaborate. And that could be Freddie there in the camp. But this was by then it's 1900. So the Depression's over. There's a bit more money around. Freddie had a printing business in Bridge Street in the city. But they were lovers of the open air, and that's why they preferred camps. This was thought to be maybe Arthur Street, not. I think it's probably Freddie Lane. And then this is the cook there. He's not old Ben, but very, very similar. And it seems that it must have been tradition for cooks to grow long beards.
So, a couple of graves.
And finally, we've got two Streeton's wonderful pictures of the camp. This one done at the time he was in the camp. This one done. Well, he went to England for a while, and then came back to Australia in 1907. And of course, he made a pilgrimage back to the camp, and that's when he painted this one. No, this is an early one actually. Okay, this is behind the camp, looking down the hill, and it's an idyllic scene. It's got nymphs running through the bushes, which was sort of a neoclassical sort of idea, but it might have recalled some real event perhaps. But like the camp down here, I think women weren't too popular. There were men's camps, and the women were only visited. There's no record of anyone actually living them. So the camp persisted there under free lay in the early 1900s, and then about 1914 or 15, the area was rezoned for Taronga Zoo. The zoo had originally been out where Sydney High School is at Moore Park, but they decided that they needed some land, so what did they chose one of the best bits of land in Sydney for the zoo, and because it had been owned by the military, they were able to rezone it, and it was given to Taronga Park. They had no use really for that area of ground. The walkway around that point has a wall which is the edge of the zoo, so the area where the camp was just neglected and got overgrown and remained overgrown for about 50 odd years until people rediscovered it. And I remember going over there in looking for it in the 1970s and barging through the bush, and I found an old inkwell and some broken crockery, so I was pretty sure that was where people were. But the thing that clinched it, of course, was that once someone, perhaps it was you, cleared off the lantana to reveal the engraving on the rock with the date, and that clinched that was the spot. Yeah.
That was Murray Block.
Yes.
Well, not just himself.
Yeah.
There was a chap who lived in Mosman all his life, and he remembers seeing it when he was very, very young, and he steered us, and we had machetes, and we cut through it.
Yeah. So now it's been reclaimed and revisitable. For the exhibition we had at the Arco, we restaged the camp, and a lot of painters, perhaps Paul was one of them, went there and painted in the camp, gave lessons there and things. And we hope to redo the exhibition sometime at Mosman, in which case we'll probably do the same thing again.
You have the support of the school in that sense.
Thank you. Any questions? I'm happy to answer any questions about it.
I mean, this is probably irrelevant, but most of the artists seem to pick this area rather than, say, the eastern suburbs. I mean, there must have been a lot of rain, brown, Vaucluse, Watson's Bay that wasn't particularly inhabited.
Well, yes. The reason people originally came over to Mosman because it wasn't polluted. Sydney, in the middle of the 19th century, was horribly polluted. There was coal fires everywhere, drainage into the harbour. There was abattoirs chopping up meat, and the refuse was going into the harbour. It was horrible. So this became the pleasure grounds of Sydney. Balmoral was one of the first pleasure grounds. Cremorne Point, all around the Spit. There was Chinaman's Beach. Every one of those places had pleasure gardens with kiosks serving food and drinks, mainly on weekends, and ferries coming across. There used to be a ferry anchoring at Balmoral and another one at Chinaman's Beach. And so it was established as a wonderful place. Everyone got this idea of Mosman as idyllic, which it still is, remarkably. It's fantastic how it's still preserved that wonderful quality. And that was the attraction for the artists.
I think there were more estates over in the eastern suburbs.
Yes, it was more.
Yes, and they were building right down to the harbour there.
Watson's Bay was a fishing village. So.
But Mosman certainly had that notion. This was the wonderful place for artists very early on. If you look at the first art society catalogues, like from 1880, dozen listing, paintings that have disappeared, but listing Mosman View and all that. So and they'd come out here on in boats and have painting classes. The head of the art society at the very first was John Hoyt, who made it very popular. He liked the area very much. And I think in Julian's book, one of the first things someone took him to look at Mosman.
That's right.
And of course, Hop. Same with Hop. He loved it so much he bought a house here.
With the clean air.
Yeah.
You know, see our casts here, which is obscuring the mural. Notice how clean they are. These same casts in the rocks are black on the top.
Oh, really? Yeah.
So nothing's changed. This is still a good place for artists. Lovely. There's a little tiny story there that I get your permission. Howard tells the story of working with Streeton, because Streeton was, Julian was older than Streeton, and Howard was younger than Streeton. And he says, I remember painting with him and going out, and Streeton used to love to get away by himself to paint. He didn't like painting with others. And he'd perch himself on a hill where nobody could get behind him. And Howard said, I remember climbing up the hill, and I could feel Streeton's eyes boring into the top of my head as I approached. And then getting behind him to look at the work. And Paul, and he had a slightly shocked tone, he'd changed everything. Because we remembered that, and you can read Smike the Bulldog, Streeton Roberts were romantics. They were incurable romantics. And so the works that they did were works of poetry. And of course Howard was more prosaic. He was a journalist and an artist as well. And so he said he'd moved trees, he'd changed this, he'd done this. That's the reason why he didn't want people looking, obviously.
Yes, idealised landscape.
Idealised landscape.
When I did that exhibition, I filmed the exhibition, and then I made a film for the ABC, where I went to the locations where the paintings had been painted and dissolved from one to the other. And the changes are quite significant. Some quite basic. It was like the foreshortening of distance and things like that. Get all the different things into the picture. Not distortions as in say surrealism or in modernism, but just rearrangements, just neatening it up.
Yes.
And, but that's artistic license. They weren't photographers. They were painters.
Has anyone else got any questions for either Paul or Albie?
Didn't the street become a official war?
Official war artist, yes. In the First World War. He was still living in England at the time, and then he went across to the Western Front. Yeah.
It's extraordinary to see those very, very sad and sort of obviously tortured works that he did of the front, the broad panoramas, with the unmistakable Streeton technique, but this grim subject, but painted with great objectivity, nevertheless.
There's an interesting Streeton story. I hope the person involved is not here, but many years ago I got a call from someone that was trying to preserve a house down on Currabeta Point, and they said it was painted by Streeton. Now it was one of the ones paintings that Streeton did when he came back to Australia in 1907. He went to the camp and looked across, and where there'd been bush were houses. He did a very nice painting including that, but Streeton was a great environmentalist, and I don't think the painting was celebrating the house, quite the opposite. But, it was used in a court case to try and preserve the house. I thought it was a bit ironic.